Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy Skills podcast by Firms Consulting. So, as you know, the world is awash with ideas, toolkits, best practices, summaries, basically anything that can tell us how we can capture some of the secret sauce that has made Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Alphabet, and so on as successful as they have been. Much has been written about Amazon. Amazon has been in the news a lot. Many books have come out trying to explain to us what makes Amazon great. And what we've always noticed, and what I've seen in particular, is that many of the books tend to capture the essence of the philosophy of what Steve Jobs was doing. But if you wanted to apply that in the real world, daily, to your own company, in a meeting, in a planning session, in a product review session, the mechanics of how to apply that philosophy has not been written down in many places. So you like the philosophy, it makes a lot of sense, but then how do you actually implement it? What's the mechanics? What do you do first? What do you do second? There are also balances. Some things are counterintuitive. There are certain trade-offs involved. Now, Bill Carr, who I'm going to have on the show today, was with Amazon for about 15 years. He's been involved in many things, from launching the digital media players, at least learning the digital media space, launching things from Prime Video, Amazon Studios, Amazon Music, digital music, and so on, whether directly running it or being part of the team. He's been through some of the most important parts of Amazon's growth, either working closely with Jeff Bezos or for Jeff Bezos's close lieutenants. Now, I wanted him on the show because he's recently put out a book called Working Backwards. And I thought that his ability to break down what Amazon was doing and how they did it in a mechanics-driven approach was going to be very useful to our listeners. So while I've read many things about Amazon, this is one of the few books, and Bill is one of the few people that can teach you the tools so that you can apply it at your own careers and your own companies. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Michael.
So where are you at the moment? Where are you doing this call from?
I'm in Seattle.
Well, that would make sense, right? You're in Seattle, a tech center. So let's get straight into this, right? So I've spent some time reading about your work and so on. The first thing I want to ask you about this book, the idea for the book, is it almost a memoir linked in with the lessons of Amazon? Which one does it fall more towards? Because it reads like a memoir, a very entertaining memoir at that.
Well, we think it's sort of like one part memoir, one part sort of, detailed sort of management book.
Yeah.
And our intent here really was to pass on what we learned to the next generation of business leaders, because all companies all fast-growing companies tend to encounter roughly the same set of problems. And what we found, so we've seen these problems at Amazon, and the driving vision really, there's actually an origin story behind sort of why we decided to write this book, how that happened. And the origin story is that a little over 3 years ago, when I was spending time as an entrepreneur in residence with a venture capital firm called Mavron, I was at an offsite meeting, a summit for the CEOs of the portfolio companies. And also in attendance was a CEO who shall go nameless, but a very prominent Fortune 25 CEO. And there was a roundtable discussion with this person, and the topic of Amazon came up. And this CEO said, Amazon, I don't know how Amazon does it. How have they managed to be so successful in such a wide variety of businesses, from cloud computing to e-commerce, digital devices, digital media? How is this possible? We're still trying to get our core business right. And it was sort of at that moment that it hit home, a realization or a belief that I had for some time, that something very special had happened at Amazon that the world doesn't know about or understand. Most people know or understand the special things about the exciting products
Sure.
and devices and services like AWS that the company created. But what no one really knows is that something else special happened, which was effectively a new management science that was
Yeah.
created, where Amazon, as a fast-growing company, encountered the same sort of problems that all growing companies encounter. But Amazon took a very different approach, or an often counterintuitive approach,
Hmm.
to how they thought about solving and managing and addressing those problems. And so I shared, I shared that discussion with my co-author Colin about what happened at this offsite, and I said, no one understands how Amazon does this. There's no source, there's no definitive source on this topic. This is an important story and important information to share with the world to answer this question: how has Amazon done it? And we believe that the next generation of business leaders would really benefit from knowing this answer. And so that's really the genesis. We wanted to
Hmm.
pass that on, and that's when we started to work on the book.
Well, to start, I think it's an extremely well written book. I must give you guys credit for that. I've read many pieces about Amazon. I've read books by people who have a, sort of an inside track at Amazon and those who claim to have an inside track at Amazon. But this book is different, I think, because you have a very good balance between management principles. And one thing you did very well was those 4 stories at the end about Kindle, Prime, streaming, and so on. Because
Mm-hmm.
you really felt like you were part of the drama as those decisions were being made. So I want to jump into some of those things because there's a lot of interesting things here, right? Let's talk about the move into Kindle, right? Because at the time, movies looked like it would be the biggest thing that people would invest in if they went digital. But as the book points out, Jeff Bezos said, let's step back and find a better way to go digital. The book explains why he said these things, but to an outsider looking in, it seems obvious that if he had picked movies, it would have been the safe bet. It would have been the obvious bet. It would have been the bet the investment community would have supported. But he picked ebooks, which was a very small space. Nobody was really making ebooks, and he had to build this whole ecosystem. So how do the Amazon principles work to allow him and the firm to take that bet and build something that nobody would have wanted to have built?
Well, it first helps to set the scene. So the scene is, it's the beginning of 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2003, Amazon had just finished the year with $5.7 billion in revenue, which, sounds fantastic. There are many companies that would give their
Yes.
right arm to have $5.7 billion in revenue. But there were problems. So problem number one is that actually, everyone thinks of Amazon today as the sprawling store that sells everything. Well, it wasn't really the case then.
Mm-hmm.
We were beginning to branch out into other categories, but they weren't big. 77% of all of Amazon sales in 2003 were books, CDs, DVDs, and VHS tapes. So the physical media business. And the other thing to know is that business was seeing declining year-over-year growth rate. So growth was decelerating.
Yes, you have a nice graph about that as well.
Which is not good. And so you were seeing sort of, call it 12, 13% growth year over year, which is not exactly, that's not hockey stick growth anymore. That's quite modest, and it's decelerating. And then the other thing that was going on is that it was very clear that digital media, that the world was changing and media was going to go digital. And the things that made it clear at that point were that the iPod was now, a little over a year old. There were more than 1 million of them. Napster had been around for, I think, a couple of years, and obviously tens of millions of people were using that to share music around the world. And photography had gone from analog to digital. It didn't take a genius to figure out that media was going digital. So at that point, the only of the three, big media categories: books, music, and video. Which video being movies and TV shows. The only one that actually existed as a business at that point, only two: music, really only on Apple, iTunes, and iPod. And there was an ebook business, but it was a pathetic little business for a couple of reasons. The number one reason was that first of all, there was a paltry selection of books to choose from. Yeah. There were well over 1 million books in print, but I think there were only about 20,000 ebooks to choose from. Number two, the publishers in one of the most short-sighted moves in the history of business decided to price their ebooks the same price as a hardcover book.
Yes.
Which makes absolutely zero sense on, about three different levels, starting with not only the P&L of the company, but also from a consumer point of view. Like, why would I pay the same money for this book? And then the third problem was the only way you could read one of these books in those days was to download it to your PC or your Mac and then walk around with read it that way. So this was not an attractive customer experience. Movies and TV shows were nowhere to be found on the scene. The motion picture studios hadn't even licensed the right to anyone yet to actually sell or rent these things electronically. So that's the scene. But then what do we do? So probably the most logical thing to do would have frankly been to chase after the music piece, because that was one that was growing. And what's notable about what Jeff decided to do in 2004 was not to say form some team and build our own clone of iTunes and iPod. That's not what he did. What he did actually is he took my manager Steve and I, who were managing the media business. I was managing half of it for the U.S. and he was managing it globally, and said, "I want to take you two guys off of that business, and you're going to go work on digital media full time." So the first thing he focused on is like, how do I put the right leaders on this thing? Because this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And so I want some leaders who are going to work on this for a long time. And the second thing is he said, we're not in a rush to go launch an iTunes iPod knockoff for the simple reason that what's the point? The customers already have that option. If we can't articulate some way in which our iTunes iPod knockoff is better and offers meaningful value to customers over that, then there's no point in building that. Yeah. So let's take a step back and look at the whole playing field of digital media and ask, well, where can we actually invent something meaningful for customers that if we brought it to them, it would really create value? And so that's when, through, frankly, a series of meetings that many, many months of research, meetings, discussions, we landed on over time, let's focus on ebooks. And the reason why we did that is we had an idea of a vision that said, look, if we could create a device, one of these problems is that no one wants to read their book on their computer. So how do we create a device that people would read their book? And what would that device look like? How would that work? What would be the capabilities of that device? It would need to work indoors and outdoors. You need to have a long battery life. You need to be able to hold many books on it. You'd need to be able to download them easily, and it'd be connected to the internet no matter where you go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all these things I'm describing sound very elementary today, but by the way, in 2004, 2005, they were not.
Yes.
And so we had to go through a lengthy process to figure out, and what we did, what we called it starting with the customer and working backwards. So we started, what is that customer experience we need to build? And then let's work backwards from there to figure out, what do we need to do to get there, to build it? And for us, that was a lot of things we had to do. We didn't know how to make a hardware device. We didn't even know how to make applications. We didn't know how to get the publishers to give us the rights to so many books, the right pricing. It's countless issues. And so that was a lengthy process of innovation and invention to get to Kindle and the ebook.
So it sounds like, if you use this as an example, but look at the other examples, right? It's very rare Amazon has had a breakout success. It looks as if you go down a path, you make a lot of mistakes, you have to constantly reinvent, constantly check, make sure you're putting out something that serves a customer need. It's almost as if you have to have a lot of grit and perseverance to see this through, as opposed to you have a set plan at the beginning?
Of course, yes. I mean, one of it's not just Amazon. I mean, I'm not as good at history of other companies,
Hmm.
but Apple's had no lack of products that have been duds over time. The Lisa, or they
Yes.
had a handheld. They had their handheld sort of. I don't even remember what it was called anymore. Their competitor to the Palm Pilot. I mean,
Yes, I remember that.
there have been countless. One of the things about Amazon's culture, what about Jeff Bezos, is recognizing that if you're actually going to invent things, you have to have a corresponding willingness to fail,
Yes.
because it's just not possible for anyone to only invent winners. You're going to be wrong sometimes,
Yes.
and sometimes you may be wrong more often than you're right. But uh, but yeah, so it requires. Jeff would often say, we need to be stubborn on the vision and flexible on the details. So that, and frankly, one of the stories we tell is the story of the business that I worked on and led, which is now known as Prime Video, where we were stubborn on the vision. The vision is, how do we have a great experience for customers to watch, buy or subscribe to and watch movies and TV shows on any device wherever they are. But it took us, 7 years of experimentation and trial and error of services that people now have long since forgotten about. Amazon Unbox, Amazon Video on Demand are the precursors
Yeah.
to Prime Video that didn't work very well. That ultimately got us there.
Yeah, so one of the common themes is, when I was a partner advising CEOs and so on, a very common thing clients would ask us to do is, given the resources they have, where should they go next? What is their next adjacency move? And it's a big field of strategy, adjacency mapping, right? But one of the consistent themes from reading the book is that Jeff and, well, the Amazon culture is not to do that. It's not to say, what can we do based on what we have? It's what should we do, even if we need to build it from scratch, if it's going to delight the customer.
That's right. And so, for example, when we started down this digital media path, my manager Steve Kessel and I, we used all the tools we've been taught in business school
Yes.
about how to say, okay, well, Gartner research says that the ebook business will be X size, over these years, and here's what music will look like, and video, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what the P&L characteristics will look like for these businesses. Let's create a SWOT analysis and look at our strengths,
Sure.
weaknesses, blah, blah, blah. But in none of those things is the word customer
Yes.
mentioned once. And so what a lot of these techniques actually tend to reinforce is what's called a skills forward approach, where a company looks at what are we good at today, and how do we take those strengths and those abilities and move, as you say, move
Yeah.
into adjacencies and create new businesses based on that. And Jeff rejected that and basically said, no. Instead, we need to use our understanding of the customer, and we had a good understanding of sort of what customers loved in the media business, and our understanding of what what would delight them in the future, but then not let it not be held back by or constrained by whether we had specific capabilities in those spaces. And we would instead follow what would be a compelling customer experience that could open up a big, broad market or avenue. In other words, you would conceive of, and the method we developed over time is something called the working backwards PRFAQ
Yeah,
approach.
it's a
So,
good approach.
right in this approach, and by the way, it was a trial and error approach to get there. We tried multiple ideas before
Yeah.
we landed on this PRFAQ. But all you do in this approach is you write a press release
Hmm.
that describes the the problem that a customer has and describes the product solution to the problem that elegantly solves it for the customer and why this will matter to them. And the beauty of this process is your press release should be 1 page or less, and it's incredibly lightweight. Any individual can write a press release. It doesn't require a team. It doesn't require special skills like, for example, creating a prototype or a mock-up does. Mm-hmm. And once you've described this, this problem and articulated the right future state or solution, then you take step 2, which is called the FAQ, frequently asked questions, and then describe, okay, well, what are the different issues, challenges, hurdles we need to deal with to actually make this a reality? How big of a team will it require? What special skills will it require? How much capital? What technical issues? What partner-based issues, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can use the combined document, this PR, press release, and the FAQ, to then evaluate many different ideas. You can review 20, 30, 40 different ideas with the PR FAQ process. And if you do this and do it well, the best ideas are going to float to the top. And then in the FAQ, it may identify like, yes, well, we need to become very good at machine learning, even though we're not good at that today. So how are we going to go do that? But if the opportunity is big enough, then these problems, you want to identify problems that are worth solving, because as we proved over and over again at Amazon, just because you don't know how to build hardware today doesn't mean you can't acquire that capability. Or just because you don't have a B2B cloud computing business today doesn't mean you can't figure out how to do that.
So let's take this conversation a bit deeper, right? If you are building products, services for what customers want, even if it's not adjacent to your core business, Amazon, obviously, like any company, has synergy across its business. But the starting point is not to look for synergy.
Yes and no. So it would be, so let's look at what are the biggest businesses for Amazon today. Amazon Web Services, the e-commerce business, the digital device business, the corresponding digital media business, and then finally the fulfillment business with Fulfillment by Amazon. So there are for each one of these, you can draw a thread back to the original core business of Amazon e-commerce. Okay, so in the case of the e-commerce business with Amazon, and then let's talk about AWS. These seem to be among the most divergent, right? One is a business to consumer business, a retail business, and one is a business to business, completely kind of different area. Well, the common thread was, as early pioneers of the internet, when we were starting off, when I joined the company in 1999, we couldn't hire people that had e-commerce experience. No one had any e-commerce experience. And then as we built things, whether it was the software to run the website, the software to run various back-end services to our website, the catalog, search, or our warehouses, there were never, today there's a dizzying array of SaaS providers to solve each one of these problems. Well, guess what? Those didn't exist in those days. And so we had to be resourceful and build them ourselves. But we noticed there were these, common problems with sort of starting up something new, and which were all of the heavy lifting involving, getting servers in place and storage solutions that our software engineers looked at. And we looked at that and combined with a new technology that came around in web services. And in fact, it was my co-author Colin, his team in the associates program at Amazon, which is the network of third-party websites that link traffic into Amazon. And they experimented with Amazon Web Services by exposing certain services to affiliates to see what they would do with them. And there was just an explosion of usage.
I just want you to explain something for the listeners. When you say explosion of usage, we're talking about the very, very early days of AWS, right? Offering much more limited capabilities.
Well, this wasn't even AWS. This was just this was just the technology of a web service.
So
So we
very basic,
exposed
very rudimentary.
we exposed the web service for the Amazon So if you were an Amazon affiliate,
Yeah.
you could access this web service that lets you access the Amazon catalog data, meaning you could, the different titles, cover art, prices of all
So
of
this is
our
like
books.
just a big server. You're giving them access to it. They can pull the data they want.
They can pull the data they want, and then they can use it the way they want.
Got
So
it.
if they want to display, you could create a different version of Amazon on your website, theoretically, that made the detail pages look different,
Yeah.
and it would just be a different way of exposing. Because a retail website is really just a digital catalog that then you have a layer to show that catalog to people so they could browse and search it, and then you have ways to actually like buy stuff and check out. So
Mhm.
we were handling that first part, the catalog. How could people display that in some alternative way? And the point was that these third-party affiliates used it heavily, and then we observed that, and we furthermore observed through a conference, having them talk about what problems they had in managing their businesses. They all had the same problem we had, which was, yeah, it's such heavy lifting to start from zero, of like getting servers in place and managing databases, and so it was really our own experience from those two things that then led to the kernel of Jeff and Andy Jassy taking that idea and saying, let's look at this further. I think there's something here. And then spending many months looking at to figure out, like, well, what is this thing, which eventually became Amazon Web Services.
Okay, now this is interesting. I want to explore this part, right? Because I think there are a lot of companies and a lot of capable people across many parts of the world working in corporate startups, governments, and so on. But a lot of times they don't know when to run with an idea. They don't know this idea could be big. So what I want to talk through a little bit here is, when you're just starting off and you're getting some interest, how do you know that this is worth investing in this month, the next month, the next one? What are the signals you're looking for?
So that's a really good question. So in this case, I would say there were, if I were then to reverse engineer this and use sort of the
Sure.
Amazon processes, again, this PRFAQ process.
Yeah, sounds good.
Today, and this is the process the team ended up using to define the problem. There was this generalized problem that we observed, and the number one point we observed was that this generalized problem for every online company had this same sort of brute force heavy lifting. In fact, the whole VC world has changed, right? In the in the late 90s, early 2000s, you would get your Series A money to allow you to afford to buy a bunch of servers to then really actually start running your thing.
That's a good point. That's a good observation.
You don't do that anymore because AWS makes it that you don't have to go do that, right? So it's easy to see now the value, but the point is, the value was that we looked at that and said, like, if we have that problem, and we knew that problem very well because we were, we had to solve and build this all the time. And if all these other people have the same problem and they look at like, how are they spending their time? Boy, if you could come up with a way for people not to have to do this, what felt like sort of plumbing or basic groundwork, and focus on the value add part piece versus a piece that everyone has to do the same thing, sort of the nuts and bolts blocking and tackling, then boy, you'd unlock amazing value. But that was all we knew at that point. We didn't really understand like exactly how that would work, what would be the value prop, what would be the detailed, how you would price it. That was what happened in the months and weeks afterwards, is to look at that. That was that understanding combined with the understanding of that when we made a web service available, wow, look how easy and fast it was for people to actually use that. So it's that pattern recognition. So what we would always say at Amazon is that we swim in data. It's observing. We didn't build things based on, again, the market research techniques I learned in business school. Like, those did not lead to the development of any meaningful products at Amazon. We didn't use those. Those are good for like validating some idea once you've got it, but they're not good for you to come up with an idea.
Yes. Let's explore this. It's very interesting, right? Because I think it's a common problem. So you've got all these affiliates and other people downloading these XML files, and they're doing creative stuff with it, and you guys are noticing, hey, hold on a second, we're getting an abnormally high amount of interest versus other
Right.
things. That's the first signal, right?
Right.
And the next signal is, okay, people like this, they're creative, so you then had a conference where 8 people attended.
Right.
I mean, 8 people.
Not a big conference.
Not a big conference. That 8 people attend, but you still know there's interest and activity that's a little bit higher than normal, even though only 8 people attended, right? So now my next question is, what is the next metric that you look for? Are you looking for the activity to stay roughly the same, for engagement to be higher, for there to be more engagement? How do you know you're onto something here? I understand that the market is big. It's a big problem. But how do you know that Amazon is onto something here?
Well, the AWS one is a tricky example because there's a big leap from expose a web service for a catalog for Amazon to building core web service, and that's where sort of the I don't want to use the word magic. The hard work comes in for then really thinking about. And we would do this all the time, by the way. Like, I'm just telling the story of one that worked.
No, sure, of course.
New technologies coming around all the time to say, okay, how do we apply this new technology in some way? Is there a way to apply this to result in some big business? Like I can't remember, there was the explosion of when the domain world changed from just .com to the sale of like all those other extensions.
Yeah.
Spent months and weeks in meetings with Jeff exploring like different, what should we buy? How should we, what businesses could create it from this? That didn't really result in anything. It's not really what it turns out those domain names are not really a decider for the web. But so you can spend a lot of time on these, just to be clear, like you can look at some new technology, but then figuring out how to apply it, just like people are looking at blockchain, or now everyone's looking at NFTs.
Yes.
Figuring out then how to then create the marketable solution, like that requires a lot of work and dedication. It was about 18 months of work between that, say that conference of 8 people, of looking at these interesting patterns, to then really thinking about what would be a product that you could build for this. And it was a lot of refinement of the thinking through this writing PR FAQs, meeting, discussing, and there's sort of no replacement for that time of thinking it through up front. It would not have been as big had we not invested that time.
Yeah, and there's a great line in the book, and you also mention it now, and I think this is maybe one of the central points here. The rate at which you iterate matters. Because if you're building something new that doesn't exist, which is what Amazon is doing, and you therefore don't know what the final product is going to look like because it's new, you have to be constantly iterating, adjusting, and learning. So it's almost as if, you can measure success by your rate of iteration. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yes and no. There's yes, and that a lot of people have taken that, and they can take that in a dangerous direction too. Yeah. So Agile is, of course, a super popular way to think about developing and coding up products. But there's a danger to Agile, which is that people confuse the fact that they have complete 2-week sprints and ship new features and products every 2 weeks, that speed of that does not result in velocity, because velocity is sort of speed plus direction. Mm-hmm. And if you're not going in the right direction, going very fast doesn't do you any good. So you have to, that iterative process has to be very considered too. You have to spend a lot of time up front thinking about, well, what is it that we are trying to build? Like what is the real problem we're trying to solve, and what are the different options for how to solve it? And if I do that, where does it lead me? Does it lead me down some big broad avenue, or is it going to be a small blind alley? And so that's really what we try to communicate in the book, that if you look at the success of products like AWS, if you look at the success of products like Kindle, the hallmark, and we don't write about it in the book, but Echo, Alexa too, the hallmark of these products is there was a lot of refinement and time just working through a Word document and debating and discussing the exact right way what to build before we set down the path of building it. But yes, for example, some of the early AWS services like Mechanical Turk, which still exists, that did not catch on, and it's I'm not sure how popular. It's still certainly not one of the most popular services today. It wasn't until we figured out through our iteration, no, it's not about building that sort of service that's somewhat up the stack. And we need to go back to the bottom of the stack, to core capabilities, compute and storage. And we were trying to create too much of a service there with Mechanical Turk. And so really the bedrock of AWS was when we figured out it needs to be at that most basic level of computational services and storage services.
That's interesting. So you must be going in the right direction for the right reason, right? Then you iterate because you are iterating towards something worthwhile. But if you start off and you become very functional and just think, okay, we're going to iterate and ship a feature update every week and we'll figure it out, then you could probably go in the wrong direction.
Right. We could have come up with 20 iterations on Mechanical Turk and it wouldn't have mattered.
Because it's the wrong direction.
Because we're working on the wrong thing. Or we could have envisioned, okay, well, that service doesn't work. Let's look at other sort of higher order services like that. And that would have been the wrong thing. It wasn't until, the good kind of iteration is that we iterated and said, that doesn't work. Why is it not working? And we formed a different hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that we need to go down further in the stack. Let's build something there. Let's build S3. Let's build EC2.
Yes.
So it's about forming, brainlessly iterating is not useful. Forming hypotheses where if you prove out the hypothesis, it leads to something big, that's useful iteration.
Yeah, I like that actually, because what normally happens is when people listen to what Amazon is doing, they try to create sound bites, and sometimes the sound bite loses the context.
Yes.
Now, in thinking about this, one of the things I realize listeners are going to do is they're going to say, okay, Bill Carr is a smart guy. He's worked on some key initiatives for Amazon. He knows Amazon, and I'm going to take some of these concepts to be more successful. But one thing I've realized that if you adopt Amazon's culture, you need to be willing to accept some big failures.
Yes. Any company that wants to, so the reason why most large established companies why ultimately they become disrupted, they don't continue to innovate. The reason why electric cars have not come from GM, they've come from Tesla. The reason why the biggest retailer, fastest growing retailer is Amazon, not Walmart, is because large companies ossify. And one of the major ways in which they ossify is that they become risk averse. They are focused on, I have this substantial revenue stream and I want to protect that revenue stream. And anything that looks like diverting resources to something speculative, large institutions are good at killing those things. It's very hard. Even at Amazon, I would tell you that even in early 2000s in Amazon, when I was working on digital media, you would be astonished by the degree to which there was a lot of the amount of institutional resistance to it.
I'm sure, yes.
There was institutional resistance at the board level. There was resistance from several of Jeff Bezos' direct reports. There was resistance down at the ground level. In many cases, when I tried to recruit people to join the team from other parts of the company, they would say, "Oh no, that's not going to work." Because what they did is the calculation in their mind was, I'm working on this other business that is already big. Why would I go to work on this little business or non-existent business where there's, what are the chances it will become as big or bigger? And that's the calculation that everyone does, whether they are thinking about their career, what should I work on to they're the CEO or on the board, and thinking about how should I invest in the future. So they become, and part of that is a fear of failure, a fear of if I go and do that, and if it fails, this will, be a big problem for me for my career. And so you have to go out of your way. You can't just give it lip service. You have to go out
Sure.
of your way to create a culture where it is failure is acceptable.
Big failure is acceptable.
Yes, expected, and you have to talk about it. You have to talk about it as, if you look at what Jeff's on record talking about. Yes, Fire Fund was a big failure, and we're working on even bigger failures
Yeah.
right now.
That was
Like,
funny.
that's very useful. The fact that he says that,
Yeah.
like, people go, oh, okay, I
I can
get it,
fail. Yeah.
right? We're going, some of the stuff we're working on is not going to work. You have to say that, because the prevailing notion is to always, of course, be optimistic and keep a stiff upper lip and say this
Yes.
thing is definitely going to work. You of course want to be optimistic and give it your best foot forward, but you have to recognize that failure will happen and not blame it on the people that worked on those things, because there's a lot of great people at Amazon. I can give you examples of where they worked on things that were stinkers,
Yeah.
and they worked on things that were super successful too.
Yes.
And it wasn't that these people were meaningfully different in one environment versus the other. It was that some ideas are better than others.
So when reading and listening to all of the tools, and some very powerful tools, I like the one about PRs, FAQs. That's unusual. I haven't seen any other company do that. The tool is only as good as the culture within which it is used. And if you're listening to these concepts and you have a rigid hierarchical culture where failure is punished, dissent is weeded out, you can't be as creative as an Amazon.
No.
Because
No,
the environment is toxic.
It doesn't work. Yeah, you have to create a culture where at all levels of the company, risk taking is encouraged. Frankly, the Amazon went as far. I discovered in the third year of my career, when I put together my annual plan for my business, that my boss rejected it, and his reason was, you haven't put anything in your plan where you're planning to take any big risks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd worked at companies like Procter and Gamble where no one
talks about risk.
I do something like that, right? And he said, look, if you don't take just some wild shoot from the hip risk, but think about your business and think about what is a big initiative that I could pursue here that it may or may not work, but if it works, would create breakthrough results, which is really the way to frame it. Now, it doesn't excuse you from also, hitting your goals kind of on a baseline, but you need to also have something big that you're working on that may not work at all, and it may set you back a bit, by the way, but if it does work, will propel you forward in a meaningful way.
So let's unpack that, right? Because that's interesting. So directionally, you have to be low risk. You have to be moving in a direction that's important to the business. But how you want to get there, you need to be creative and take the risk. So directionally low risk, but the how is the way you take the risk?
Well, so one of the ways that Amazon solved this problem, so let's go back to the example. So here I was in 2003. Steve and I were managing this physical media business.
Yeah.
So why didn't Jeff tell us, keep running the physical media business and just now build out the digital business? In fact, we actually had an ebook business.
Yeah.
It was tiny. We had a team. We had like 3 people working on it. He could have told us, or what I'd say 99% of companies would have said, why don't you work on really building up that digital media team and go, chase what Apple's doing and others, right? So one of the ways that Amazon solves that problem is by compartmentalizing who's working on managing and stewarding the existing business that's paying the bills, and then creating separable teams to go work on new initiatives. And so that was one of the first examples of that. So,
sure.
So we solved that problem, because if we had tried to build digital media and take those risks within it, we would have never taken big enough risks. We would have never thought big enough. We would have never had the bandwidth or time to go create a hardware team, bring in the right leaders from a software and technology point of view. And so the way that Amazon figured out to solve this is by not making invention somebody's part-time job, but assigning the right leaders to make it their full-time job, and letting other people, by the way, go, stay with the business that's already built and manage that on a full-time basis. So it's this concept of the separable, single-threaded team. And every one of the major innovations that Amazon came up with, fulfillment by Amazon, AWS, the device business, digital media, in every case, we didn't get there until and unless we actually took one of our senior most leaders, of a vice president, in some cases more than one, and said, you're now going to work on that and nothing else. You already have a huge job. Stop that job and go work on this, because this is so important. And so that is really, and you can manage the risk that way too. It wasn't as we didn't start off with a big team. We started off with no team. We had to go figure out, it's more like we are entrepreneurs with we have venture backing. We haven't, dipped into our budget yet.
Yes.
Come up with a business plan and then get the backing and proceed from there.
Okay. So now I think you've, laid it out for me a little bit better. So Amazon is encouraging you to take risks. And the sort of safety net is, if you want to do something, you've got to put together your plan, PR, FAQ, that needs to get approval. So take the risk, but show us you know what you're doing. Otherwise, we will not fund you for it. Is that the safety
Yes.
net?
So what I would definitely not encourage a CEO to do is say, yes, you, Jane or Joe, I want you to go build me a new division X. Here's a blank check for $100 million.
Yes.
Come back to me in 6 to 12 months and tell me how it's going. I wouldn't do that at all.
Yes.
Instead, it was like, you are going to go work on this new initiative, and the first thing you're going to do is behave no differently than an entrepreneur would in their garage.
Yeah.
Except you have an office here at Amazon, and you've got you're paid, your career is safe, and go come up with the plan. Go come up with a detailed plan. That's what Andy Jassy did. So Andy Jassy, who will be the second CEO of Amazon, he had, he'd joined the company in 1997, and in 2001 he took on this role of being Jeff's technical advisor or chief of staff. He spent 2 years going to meetings with Jeff, and after those 2 years in 2003, he could have really rolled off and taken virtually any job in the company. He was a vice president, but he decided, I'm going to go work on this new area of AWS. And really, for the next 18 months, all he did was hire people, build a team, a small team. This is not a big team, like you'd call it like 20 people. Write documents, write business plans, product ideas using this PRFAQ concept to say, what are we going to go build here in AWS? And they made some prototypes, et cetera, et cetera. They did that for 18 months. Before they shipped shipped or started building the first product. So yes, it's and oh, by the way, what it's important to note, Jeff was spending at that time, starting in 2003, about half of his time with Andy and the AWS team, and the other a quarter of his time with Andy and the AWS team, and a quarter of his time with, me and Steve and the other leaders in the digital media team to figure out what we're going to build there. So he was actively cultivating those businesses and was working with them step by step to figure out what they should go build. It wasn't a hands-off blank check process at all. It was a very hands-on, we're going to cultivate this together.
I'm hearing a very consistent pattern in all of your stories, and let's talk about that. It sounds as if the way Amazon works is you first pick the right person, you then talk about how you're going to do it, and then you decide what you're going to do. But, just a cursory view of other companies, they first pick what they're going to do.
Right.
Then they hire someone behind it, then they put the resources behind. It seems as if Amazon flips the script around. Yes,
and there are some variations on this where in some cases, I would struggle to give you an example. And some of these things, post-date me, like, there's lots being said about Amazon and healthcare, and did they just bring someone from the outside? But even if they did that, yes, they would. The first step is, we've identified this area of opportunity. This seems like a big opportunity to us, because inside a company, if you're coming up with ideas all the time, the good best ideas are going to bubble to the top. And then at some point you say, yeah, we should staff this. We should put somebody on this. We should put a leader on this who's going to make this real. And so yes, the next step is like who's going to go do this, and then they go away and they refine that idea, because the idea at that point is just kind of raw clay, and then they need to go spend weeks, maybe months, sculpting that clay, defining it very carefully. And as they do it, they're checking in with senior management, like, here's my latest draft on this, on the PRFAQ. What's this product going to be? How's it going to work? And Amazon will do, for the biggest, most important products, like you could go through 6 or 7 of those reviews, right? Where you're checking in with Jeff, and oh, by the way, he brings in other leaders, so you're getting many wise, experienced heads to weigh in on these things. And then once finally, like, yes, now this is the right plan. You've got the right PRFAQ, and it defines in there, what the budget is. Here you go. Here's your budget. Now go build that as fast as you can.
So there's a lot of incubation of the idea, not of the product.
Right.
There's a lot of talking about, you talked about the PR press release. I like that idea. The FAQs. I'm guessing there's like lots of rewrites until people feel that this is going to solve a big problem in a way that's going to delight customers.
That's right. That's right. If you don't read the press release and say, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I should go get that. Then it's not worth doing. So keep working on that until you're there. Once you've got that, then go work through the detailed questions. How is this technically feasible?
Yes.
What kind of capital is required? And oh, by the way, as you do that, you may encounter plenty of examples of where that product in the PR sounds phenomenal. But oh, by the way, once you've now dipped into the FAQ and the feasibility, this really isn't a viable thing. It's not viable at this time, maybe because perhaps the compute costs are too high, or the FAA hasn't approved, drones to fly all over the place, or whatever the constraint is. And so in some cases, that means you set it aside until those constraints are met. I mean, the initial document that you could say it was the first articulation of Amazon Echo was written roughly in 2004, and the Echo, if I get my history right, launched around 2013 or 14.
That's a long,
it's like a decade later.
Wow.
So it didn't happen because the technology that we needed for voice recognition, wasn't there. Among other things, there were actually several things that weren't there, but because frankly, that idea is just inspired by Star Trek. Like you talk computer, plot a course to SETI Alpha 6, right? The idea isn't. The idea's been out there forever, but how do you, what's the point where the technology meets the idea, and knowing when it's time to reach out. Yes, there's some stretch I need to do, but it's within reach. I can stretch now and I can get to that idea.
So coming back to the principle of single-threaded leadership, right? Does it mean there's one person who's 100% focused on this from 2004 to 2013, trying to figure out how to serve the market need?
In that case, no. In that case, in fact, it was a long time before someone was assigned to that. No, but in many cases, yes, a single-threaded leader was applied to work on, I was the single-threaded leader for video. And, I started working on that in 2004, and the first version of the video service we launched was in 2006 called Amazon Unbox. But it really wasn't until 2010, 2011 when we launched Prime Video that we actually had the right product. Yes. So that's where there's a good example of there were lots of iterations. It was a lot of iterating and trying to solve the core problems. But it wasn't really until we solved, in that case, the core problems were a distribution problem,
Yes.
having devices and apps that were out there, and having the right content. And it wasn't until 2011 that the pieces fell in place for us to actually solve those problems.
So there's a lot of sanity checks going on here. In the one situation like the Echo, if the technology is just not viable, there's no point in having a single-threaded person because you can't do anything. It's almost a physical barrier there.
That's right.
But if the technology is within reach, may require some R&D, but it's within reach and all the other pieces are doable, then you put the right person to try to find a way for Amazon to win, because there's no insurmountable barrier. It's just creativity. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yes, for example, let's use a technology that we all expect will exist someday: flying cars. Right? Yeah. At some point, do we think that we'll be able to get in a vehicle of some kind and not have to be stuck on the ground? I think it's fair to assume at some point in human development we'll solve that problem. Okay, yes. But I'm not an expert. I assume the problems are weight, power, navigation, safety.
Yes.
But the point is that if you as a company or Amazon believe that you are looking at first of all, you have to understand like what actually are all those barriers, and then look at those problems and say, do I have now a novel solution if to the weight problem? Have I come up with a way? If the hurdle is it has to weigh less than 500 pounds, and here's the heaviest part, I figured out a way to solve that problem. That's a good example of where that's how to think about it, which is that understand what are the constraints, and then the leaders, the first ones there, are the ones that are the first to jump over the hurdle to figure out, like, I've got the solution to one or more of those constraints.
And it sounds as if the overriding theme here is identify the customer, make sure the customer is worth pursuing, and then work from there. And all these other tools are really enablers to get that right. And then It sounds like the other thing here is that manage your cash well enough so that you can constantly iterate and fail where you need to, because it's going to happen.
Yes, people. So everyone who thinks about Amazon today thinks of it as, appropriately so, one of the wealthiest, most successful, largest companies in the world, which it is all of those things. Yeah. Well, in the mid 2000s, it wasn't any of those things.
Yeah.
And in fact, we had barely escaped bankruptcy by the skin of our chins in 2001. And we were a retailer, and retail margins are thin. Yes. Like, the most successful retailers in the world are great at driving out costs and staying lean. And we were, I could go on and on, but we were not, dripping with resources. Like if you could scrape together 5 engineers to go work on a project, like that was magical. Today, people probably have 50 engineers falling out of their pocket at the company, but that was not the case then. So the way that so again, sticking with Prime Video, let's look at that one, which is a huge business today, where more than 100 million people around the world use that product, and it generates a whole lot of revenue for the company by driving Prime memberships. And but it wasn't going so well from 2006 until 2011. So how do we, why do we could have killed it, right? Why do we not kill the product, or why do we keep going? Well, one of the reasons why we could do it was that I had a very small team. By any standards, I had about a 60-person team total working on that business. And while we were losing money, we were not losing that much money. And so the overall investment for the company was manageable. It was sustainable. And did we take our money and do big, what we did not do is ever use our money on one-time events that once you used it was gone, like marketing. One of the things anytime you observe some early stage company that's, doing huge broad scale marketing early in their evolution, that's a signal that they are, there's an excellent chance that they will not survive, because once you've spent that money, it's gone.
Yeah.
And the most important thing to do is to find product market fit and be sustainable. So we would be lean. We would have a small team. We'd have a tiny marketing budget. We were just focusing religiously on how do I invest every dime and dollar into solving the key problems of the customer experience. And then once we had the right formula, then we exploded. And then I had a separate problem, which was I had to take that 60-person team and turn it into like a 600-person team, in a matter of like 2 years.
So let's unpack. That's very interesting, right? So which product was it that you mentioned you had 5 people working on it?
Well, 5 people was just a for instance of at any time, like you might be working, you might be a leader in the retail business, and you like, there's this one feature I need, this one, I for my jewelry business, if I could just get this feature, I just need 5 engineers, but like you couldn't get them, like you wouldn't get the budget.
So let's go with this, because I think it's interesting and it's useful. It's quite insightful as well. So the first thing is capital efficiency is a big theme at Amazon.
Yes.
You make the maximum return from $1 before you earn the right to get another $1, right? Now, a lot of people presume that Amazon is so successful because they're throwing money at a problem. But it sounds like it's the opposite here. You keep an initiative large enough so that you can keep testing and perfecting it, but small enough so it's not a major drag on the business. And only when you get things right and you sort of build the right business model and you see some success, then resources are assigned to you.
Yeah. So, this is, I'll just caveat this, say this is a little unfair. I don't want to pick on them too much, but let's just look at early digital media. Let's look at what Microsoft did.
Yeah.
So while I had in digital music, I had, again, about a 50-person team.
Yeah. Small
team. And I actually had a bigger digital media business, music business than Microsoft did. They had, I don't know how many people, but I guarantee you they had hundreds of people. They were building the device Zune and the service Zune.
Yeah.
And they were spending gobs of money on marketing. And today, Microsoft has no digital music business. And I can't speculate on all the reasons why, but I'm sure that one of the reasons why is they spent, tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars between 2004 and 2010 on Zune, and were losing money and gaining no traction. So they gave up. But they might have actually, maybe if they had been lean, and maybe if they had been conserved their money and waited. In other words, they spent a lot of money on the business to try to make it big.
Yes.
Amazon invested a little bit of money and waited until there was clear evidence that it was big, and then spent more money.
It's choosing to deploy your capital to build something that works, as opposed to deploying your capital to draw customers to something where you have no evidence it works yet.
Right.
And if they hadn't spent $200 million, maybe they could have kept that business going because it was small enough to keep on perfecting it, but not so big that it became a drain on their balance sheet.
Because, by the way, once you spend all that money and say, here's what our first version of the product is, if they get it wrong, the changing of it is very expensive. With my 50-person digital music team, I was nimble and we could adapt and okay, now if this isn't working, let's go in a completely different direction. I mean, we actually started off trying to build what is today is the business model. We tried to build an all-you-could-eat subscription service for music. Partway in, we actually scrapped that plan and said this isn't going to work because there were no devices to support it, or not enough devices there, and weren't good enough. The customer experience would be good enough. So now we're going to build an MP3 a la carte download service, which is what we launched.
Yeah.
And then today, as you know, no such service exists. Today, what exists is now a subscription all-you-can-eat service in Amazon Music. And, oh, by the way, a variant on that in Amazon Prime. So we remained nimble, and we were able to adapt to what would really work in the marketplace.
This also reminds me of a discussion I always have with executives. Be wary of how you interpret benchmarks, because you don't know how that company operates and why they're incurring costs the way they are and why they're hiring so many people. They could have a very different operating philosophy, very different culture.
That's right.
And if you just say that, well, we need to have 500 people in our music division, you need to know what you're going to do with that.
Yeah, I think the conventional wisdom for big companies is that when they see here's this big opportunity, um, is then to use what they're good at in some cases, which is deploying large teams, large marketing groups,
Yes.
and then they think they can will it into existence.
Yes.
And in fact, if I go back to the first meetings I had with Jeff on digital music, that's how I had approached it too. We used those conventional business school techniques. Jeff, here's the forecast for how big digital music will be over the next decade. Let's project that our market share will be 20%. On what basis did we have to project our market share? None. And that was Jeff's point. It's ridiculous to project what your market share is. The market share will depend on, do you build something that's delightful enough for customers to earn their business and their trust? And so I think that's sort of one of the ways that Jeff was smart to invert our thinking and say, no, you can't focus on it. And I encountered this with people that would show up on, I would hire people into the digital media team, and they would assume, okay, well, now that we're here, this digital media thing is going to work where it hasn't been working for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Now that because I am working on it today, now it's going to become a thing. This is sort of it's for better or worse, we all have a certain degree of hubris.
Yes.
And overconfidence that just because we're working on it now, it's going to work.
This is a very important point because I see this all the time, right? Not just MBA schools and so on. I see this in corporate world every day, whereby an investment is made based on the size of a market, if it's large, growing, and then the thinking is that 5% market share shouldn't be too hard to get. So if we can get 5% market share and it's a $2 billion business, let's do it. But then the question becomes, can you get 5%?
That's right. The point is to focus on you're entitled to 0%.
Yes.
Now develop the plan that proves why you're entitled to any percent, and the basis of that is that you've built something that is differentiated from the competition and adds real value. If you're just copying the competition, now that can work if you say, I'm copying the competition, but I have a structural advantage and I can make it 30% cheaper.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. That can work. And that strategy, Microsoft was great with that strategy for, I'm not great at the history of that, but as everyone knows, the early applications that they developed, they copied off of other people, but I assume they had superior distribution capabilities or some other capability that was crucial that allowed them to actually become number one. So if you have those, that's fine. But if you don't have some structural advantage, then your product your PR has to describe, like, what is that? What's going to make it better for the customer? How is it better, faster, or cheaper?
And this comes back to the point you've raised a few times. It's that you've got to identify the person and you've got to identify how they're going to do it, which will give you the what, but you don't start with the what, which is what everyone does. What are we going to do? We're going to enter the aerospace market because if we get 5%, we're going to be millionaires, right?
Right. Or we're going to enter the electric car market.
Yes.
Or
and we're going to will it in. We're going to will it in. We're going to raise $2 billion and we're going to do it.
Right. Or GM being, actually the best example, I'll tell you the best example that's willing it is Quibi, which I observed this train wreck from afar. And, if they had just called me up, I could have saved them a lot of time and angst. Because we learned a valuable lesson about this at Amazon. But instead of blowing $2.5 billion, we probably lost $2 million. And the Quibi was, for those that aren't clear, that was the startup with Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, where they said, there's a hole in the marketplace. The world's going mobile. There's all these, movie and TV show services like Netflix and Amazon that do long form video, 20-minute TV shows, 22-minute TV shows, and 44-minute TV shows and movies. But people want snackable size content as exhibited by their behavior on YouTube. So we'll make, but YouTube has crap content. how do you take the high quality content of Netflix and Amazon and marry it with the short form of YouTube of like 2 to 5 minutes and make it optimized for mobile phones. So at one level, you could look at this and say, this is entirely logical. They've looked at consumer behavior, they've put some things together, so this makes sense. But they forgot a couple of important things. What they basically did in describing is they described a new form of media. They described high quality, paid, you have to pay for this subscription, short form content. That does not exist today. And I'll give you a parallel example of this. Back in the mid, early around 2008 or 9, after we launched the Kindle ebook, right? Amazon launched something called Amazon Shorts, and which meant like, now that we have ebooks, the short story can now flourish, right? Short stories have never been a thing because who could buy a book that's one short story? Now you can. Now you could buy a short story for 99 cents. This is going to become the thing. And we went out and we recruited great authors. We created a great experience. You could discover them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. Well, guess what? Amazon Shorts never took off. And what I learned from that experience is to think that you can actually create a new form of a media form where you defined it in cost, structure, size, and just because you will it into existence doesn't mean the customers will want to get it. And that's what happened to Quibi, is that they put a bunch of data points together, but the media, the form of media that they describe, where people have to pay a subscription, it's 5 minutes or less, and it's high quality, it didn't exist. And guess what? It turns out that so far people don't want that. And anticipating consumer behavior, if you think consumer behavior is not logical.
Yes.
And so you can't, the smarter move would have been for Quibi to at some small scale tested this, validated that in fact this form of media works.
Yes.
And if they validate that's true, then go spend the $2.5 billion. That's how Amazon would have done it.
And maybe a deeper insight here is that maybe the consumer is ready for this, but just not in the way Quibi delivered it to them.
Could be.
I mean, we don't know. But as you say, someone should have tested this.
That's right. The point is they spent a whole lot of money on a product where they had not first determined if they had product market fit.
It's like the world's most expensive pilot.
That's right. That's right.
Right. So they went all out and they delivered this. Bill, thank you so much. That was one of the most entertaining calls I've ever had. I learned a lot. I think our listeners are going to like it. You clearly know Amazon well. The book's very well written. I enjoyed this. I mean, it was a great discussion. I must thank you for it. I know you obviously spent a lot of time working on the book. It shows a lot of thought went into it. I think, it's whenever I read a book, I always think, let's find something useful from this. But in this situation, there were a lot of things useful. It wasn't hard to search for it. So I want to thank you for making yourself available and for this wonderful conversation. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for the kind words about the book.
No problem. Take care. We'll be in touch and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.